Welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I am your host. I say this every week, Dane Waters. It's kind of redundant. I should say something else. I know you look at the background, you think maybe I'm at Disney World, but no, this is the background to Tallinn, Estonia, where I was there for a few days. Beautiful, beautiful country and beautiful city and the Baltics, and it's very relevant these days to talk about Tallinn because there's a lot of concern about what's happening between Trump and Putin and the Ukrainian war. The Estonians are very, very supportive of the Ukrainians, and they're very concerned about what's going to happen as far as any peace deal, settlement, which we'll talk about in the second half of the show. But as we all know, so let's talk real quick about the highlights around the world. We have this meeting coming up between Trump and Putin, which, as I said, we'll talk about in the second half of the show. Trade wars around the world. There's a lot of, I'm doing a lot of stuff with Taiwan these days, and there's concern there that they had the recall effort against some KMT or pro-China, mainland China lawmakers that failed, and so the Chinese are putting a lot of pressure on the president of Taiwan to resign because saying it's disgraceful what's happened. But there's a correlation here. I mean, what happens in Ukraine and what happens in Russia and what happens in the Middle East, which we'll talk about here in a second, and what's happening between China and Taiwan, it's all related. I mean, I think that, look at all the conflicts around the world, they're all, they're all feeding off of each other. And so we should talk about that. And the other thing I want to talk about, what's interesting is that, a lot of people aren't paying attention, but between Colombia and Peru, there's some issues brewing there's this little island off the coast of Colombia that the off Peru that the Colombians are now claiming is theirs. And so I think you're going to see more and more issues happening around the world about territorial integrity, which is something that we definitely have to talk about, and we'll tackle in the first section. And the last thing I want to talk about real quick is Mother Nature. I mean, we heard about the seventh largest earthquake ever happening off the coast of Russia. This is just after a few months ago we had the one in Thailand. I think Mother Nature is getting a little unhappy with what's happening around the world. I think we just definitely need to pay more attention to what's going on there as well. So anyway, all that being said, let's take a quick break and we'll be back with our first guest Around the World with Dane Waters. Thank you.
What we've always maintained is the never Trump movement. I'll break it down into a couple of Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of Egyptian ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote very long.
the never Trump movement. I'll break it down into a couple of Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of Egyptian
Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. So let's get started. We have a lot to talk about. I mean, we're going to talk about the Middle East today, and we're going to talk about Ukraine, but I'm very honored to have back with us Asher Westropp-Evans. Asher is a public affairs, media, Middle East expert, one of the smartest guys I know about what's going on. It's always a pleasure to see you, Asher. Thanks for being here.
Dane, thanks so much for having me.
So I've already warned Asher, I got some tough questions for him today, but I'm sure he can handle it. You know, he's always very good at this. So let's get started. Oh, God, there's so much to talk about. Let's talk about journalism.
Yep.
You know, let's talk about, I need to ask, what's going on with what many people consider the assassination of these Al Jazeera journalists in the Gaza? What's going on? Help us understand that.
Yeah, well, look, I can speak at this stage to the narratives that are going on at the moment when it comes to this. So obviously, the particular focus has been on Anas al-Sharif. He was one of the most prominent journalists remaining in Gaza. Al Jazeera's sort of senior correspondent based there in Gaza, but has been known for a long time, in accordance with documents that the IDF published way back in October of last year, to have been receiving funds from Hamas, to have been part of this rocket brigade, to have been paid an ongoing salary, been paid funds for injuries that he received during training. That's what these documents purport to show, as released by the IDF. Now, the IDF has chosen at this time to target Anas and to target al-Sharif specifically in this particular rocket barrage, and this has been an open statement made by the IDF saying that this was intentional. This wasn't some byproduct. This wasn't a journalist that got in the way, that this man was being targeted as a terrorist, as a participant in rocket brigades, as someone who has publicly on social media displayed sympathies and awareness of Hamas and their actions way back, obviously, on October 7th, 2023. And this is the IDF narrative that's coming out. In contrast, obviously, with other narratives that we're hearing from Al Jazeera and others who say that no, he was purely a journalist and a correspondent, and that Israel is trying to silence journalism in the Gaza Strip.
Well, let me ask this, as a journalist, did the IDF or the Israeli government make any request of Al Jazeera to remove him? Did they make these claims publicly? Did they do anything in advance to try to get him out of there and say it's unacceptable that he's there?
Yeah, I mean, you can see articles, you can see documents, you can see statements published, as I said, back in October 2024, when al-Sharif was identified explicitly and shown to have been a member of Hamas by the IDF. The documents were said to be unequivocal and clear in accordance with the IDF's own statements, and to say that this man was affiliated with Hamas. And Al Jazeera themselves, by the way, have admitted that he had Hamas affiliation, but claimed it was a long time ago, it was no longer relevant, etc. And that this man, who was at any stage, whether it was in the past or currently, as IDF documents show, affiliated with a terrorist organization. And I guess the question is, likewise, if we were talking about claimed journalists in the Battle of Mosul during the period when ISIS was in charge that had been affiliated with ISIS, would we accept them as journalists, similar to those in Afghanistan, Iraq, or wherever, if they'd had Al-Qaeda affiliations? Would those be deemed as acceptable if they were simply in the past, or if they were current but not regarded as critical by a current employer? And I think that sort of awareness of this situation does need to be considered when we consider what al-Sharif's role and whether it was a legitimate element of the IDF to target him specifically.
Would you argue that al-Sharif has that in his reporting, which I don't know, I have to admit I've never watched any of his reporting, but do you believe that his reporting was biased in support of Hamas?
Look, there is one narrative that comes out of the Gaza Strip, and that is the Hamas narrative. And there are many conversations that can be had as to why there isn't more narrative capability available, but we're talking about an extremist, fundamentalist, authoritarian regime. This is not a space in which you can operate freely as a journalist. And this has been a criticism of Israel, the IDF, the Israeli government, and many others for a long time, that people purport to be free and independent journalists operating inside the Gaza Strip, but that simply isn't possible. You can't get access, you can't get credentials, you can't move freely through the Gaza Strip as a journalist independently without being attacked or falling afoul of Hamas. And so if you want to continue operating, if you don't want to see your head end up on a spike or be removed from the situation, then you need to follow the Hamas line. And al-Sharif was very much in that, as we've seen with photos of him cuddling up and smiling with Sinwar and Hania and the others in the past. This was a man who was very much part of the system that existed there, which allowed him to operate as a quote-unquote journalist, but while simultaneously potentially being, as the IDF has shown, on the payroll of Hamas.
So let me ask you this question. I mean, it's a very complicated situation. We all know it's a very complicated. There's no, I mean, it's one of the most complicated regions in the world, what's happening in Gaza and happening in that part of the world. But let me ask you this question, just theoretically. If
Mm.
I, Dane Waters, if I were to sit here and say that I am concerned about seeing the death of innocent Palestinians in Gaza, if I say that, would you label me anti-Semitic?
Not in the slightest, Dane, and nor would I say that that is anything unreasonable. I myself am also deeply concerned with seeing the deaths of innocent Palestinians. However, the only additional caveat that we need to make with that is not only we are set up seeing the deaths of innocent Palestinians, but we need to understand why this is happening, the causes, and how we serve to actually mitigate this, not just for this war that has been going now for getting very close to 2 years, but also long into the future. And this is where I think there is a bit of an issue when it comes to divides, particularly when you see sort of a more European and sort of Western, I suppose, approach to how this war can be wrapped up, and Israel's approach, which is saying that this needs to be stopped in the long term by ensuring that Hamas is removed from power, that there is a demilitarization that goes on all across the Gaza Strip, and of course, that there is a de-radicalization of the civilians there that have lived under Hamas rule for approaching 20 years now. Now, as we deal with all those different factors, we can say that, of course, civilian death is terrible, but Hamas can stop this war now. The war would stop almost certainly on a dime. It could stop tomorrow if they would release the remaining hostages, if they would put down their arms, step away from power, and allow a civilian government or a foreign government to come in. I'm talking about a coalition of Arab nations, for example, is one of the propositions that's been put on the table, to come in and rebuild without the threat of remilitarization. This is what Israel is calling for. And if this happened tomorrow, Israel would stop the war. The war would be stopped in its entirety. So we need to remember that when we talk about the death of civilians. This is terrible. No one wants to see civilians die, but we need to understand how we can stop this for the long term.
And so let's talk about the Gaza plan, the new Gaza plan. The reoccupation of Gaza. I mean, so let me take your scenario there. Okay, so Hamas, the leadership of Hamas says, okay, here are the hostages. We basically surrender. We agreed to no longer exist or whatever that technical happens. But does this also mean that they have to acknowledge that the two-state solution is gone, that there's never going to be a Palestinian state?
I don't think those two things are connected necessarily at all. I mean, I think what Israel's calling for here is, and I think perhaps there's been a misappropriation of certain language or a mistranslation of certain language. When Israel talks about reoccupying Gaza at the time being, outside of a few extremists, but in terms of the mainstream Israeli view, they're talking about a military occupation in the short term, a short, decisive military campaign with the goal to root out the last elements of Hamas military capability inside Gaza City. They've been hiding amongst the civilian structure there in those densely populated civilian areas that Israel hasn't wanted to go into, because we also know there are hostages being held there, and because it is the last bastion where many civilians are hiding, unfortunately, with Hamas military members and infrastructure hiding amongst them, which again, we saw these ghosts that hide in the wind. We saw during the last ceasefire when Hamas had these grand ceremonies and were able to come out in full uniform, were able to come out with banners and tables and a full-scale ceremony. We saw that these happen. I mean, this is an army that only put on their uniforms when they're not fighting, conversely. But in terms of, what we're talking about here in Israel is a short, concise military campaign, but with the goal to remove Hamas in order for a civilian government to be able to come in, and whether that be a local Palestinian government, whether that be other Arab states coming in to help with rebuilding a government serving as stakeholders to help the distribution of aid, the rebuilding process, and the redevelopment process of Gaza, which I think is sort of the primary goal of Israel and the Israeli government at the moment. But certainly, it's not talking about long-term resettlement, as was the case prior to 2005, when Israel unilaterally pulled out of Gaza. There are only very fringe elements of Israel and the Israeli government that are even talking about any idea such as that.
So how does the everyday? I mean, what is you're there in Israel because you're in Tel Aviv. I mean, how do most Israelis feel about what's happening in Gaza?
Well, look, Dan, there's a diversity of opinions here. I mean, again, Israel is a thriving democracy. There is a large scale of different opinions, ranging from those protests that are seen at this point multiple times a week. I believe there's even a continuous presence down on Kaplan Street, which is where the main protests are held, next to the IDF headquarters there. There is an ongoing protest that says this war needs to end now. We need to get the hostages back immediately, and whatever needs to be done to achieve that should be done now. There are other groups that say that ending the war now would be almost a betrayal of the people who have fought and died thus far, and that we need to make sure the job is done before the war is completed. And of course, there are others, as I said, on the fringes who might call for a full reoccupation of Gaza into the long term and resettlement. But I would again say they stand at the fringes. Not to mention, of course, the 2 million Arab Israeli residents of Israel, who themselves, part of the thriving democracy, are talking about potential solutions and long term plans that could see whether it be the expansion of the Palestinian Authority into Gaza to take back control there, whether it be having foreign states come in. I mean, many of these Arab Israeli citizens of Israel, which make up a significant voting bloc and have significant representation in the Knesset and the Israeli parliament, do want to see some sort of just solution that allows for a longer term ceasefire, because they don't want to see their own communities torn apart in any way in that sense. So, there is a large diversity of opinions. Israel is not a monolith. And that is, again, part of the thriving democratic principles of Israel, the only democratic state in the Middle East.
No, actually, there's one thing amazing about a democracy. It's a testament to a true democracy when various opinions can be espoused without having to be locked up and taken to prison. Sadly, there are too many countries that do put you in prison if you say something against the government. So let's just go back to the practicality of ending what's happening in Gaza. Okay, so the Israeli IDF, they go in there, short occupation, to root out Hamas. Now, many people claim that many people in Gaza have become more sympathetic to Hamas because of what's going on. I mean, how do you actually root out Hamas? Now, you say take away their military capability. I mean, how do you define victory in that regard?
Look, it's certainly not easy, Dane, but I would push back on your point there that you said many have become more sympathetic to Hamas. We have seen over the last several months multiple attempts at large-scale protests inside Gaza coming out against Hamas, and there are those who would speak, in private, sometimes, behind closed doors, that would say inside Gaza that they are tired of Hamas, that Hamas has brought them nothing but wreck and ruin, and that they need to have some sort of different governance and different structure so they can get on with their lives. Again, civilian suffering is something that we are all acutely aware of, and it is certainly not the goal of Israel and not the goal of almost anyone of decent thought that I know inside Israel. So that is not the end goal here by any means. But in terms of, to answer your question in full, how you would root out Hamas, this is a complex process and procedure, and I wouldn't go into how I imagine the specific steps would go. I'd leave that to military minds and other civil developments, but I imagine it would involve critical stakeholders, again, the moderate Sunni Arab states that surround the region that have worked with Israel in the past and would be willing to do so again in the future. So the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, potentially the Saudis. There are many potential contenders who might be willing and able to get involved and help creating some sort of civilian governance structure. But these models exist. I mean, as I said in the past, ISIS was rooted out of Mosul and Aleppo in the past. If we look back into the 20th century, there are numerous examples of extremist ideologies and extremist regimes who were rooted out, who were taken out of a system, root and stem, whose people were de-radicalized, who they were disarmed, and all the weaponry was taken away. The military infrastructure that has been built, a web of tunnels, 450 kilometers long, should I say, under the current estimates. We're talking about longer than the New York Metro, built under this strip of land in Gaza. It's unbelievable, the infrastructure there. That needs to be taken apart and reinvested into civilian infrastructure, to redevelop Gaza, to rebuild it. That is a goal that everyone in Israel and the region could hope for, but it needs to be done without Hamas being still in power, because otherwise 5, 10, 15, 20 years, however long it takes, we will find ourselves back in this same position with civilians caught in the crosshairs.
So, Hamas is, in addition to being military, they're a political organization. They were elected in Gaza, right? So
they were.
As we know,
once.
after
they were elected once and never again.
Right. Well, so I'm just trying. I know that when we invaded, we went into Iraq, we banned the Ba'athist Party, for example. So would you imagine that you would ban Hamas as a political party? Is that what would happen?
I would imagine that in alignment with its designation as a terrorist organization by most of the Western world and the developed world, that there would be an understanding that a terrorist organization, again, akin to ISIS, who also had political wings, who were involved in their organization as much as they had a military wing that was out beheading people, destroying ancient monuments, and putting people to slavery, both traditional, sexual, and whatever else, that Hamas would not be allowed to operate with impunity as a designated terrorist organization, and that they would need to be replaced with another form of civilian governance. Now, what exactly that looks like, at this stage, hard to say. I don't want to be prescriptive here in terms of what that could possibly be. There are a wealth of options on the table. But I would say Hamas, as an organization that in its founding charter calls for the genocide and destruction of Israel in totality, cannot be allowed to continue existing. I mean, this is the fundamental principle which founded this organization. It cannot be living in parallel to Israel, and that lesson was learned the hard way on October 7th, 2023. Israel will not allow that to continue, and this is where I think a lot of the standoff lies. Hamas still holds chips. They still hold 20 hostages. They are unwilling to give up, 20 living hostages. They are unwilling to give up, not to mention the many more bodies that they hold, that they won't hand back to Israel and end this war in the short term, and then into the longer term agree to a dismantling of their infrastructure in order for there to be some sort of future for their own people. And until that awareness comes in, until they're able to get pressure from their backers in Qatar, in Iran, and other nations that would show them support, I mean, the people will suffer in the meantime. The civilians on the ground will be suffering in the meantime. They won't be allowed to rebuild, redevelop, and regain their homes. And I think that's the sad state of affairs.
So how is Hamas still existing financially? I mean, is money getting to them from other sources?
I mean, certainly a lot of their funding has been cut off. I mean, we saw in the past the literal suitcases of cash of Qatari cash that were coming into the Gaza Strip. Obviously, Gaza is a shell of what it once was. No one is pretending that, again, almost 2 years of military operation haven't massively destroyed Hamas and much of their infrastructure. They don't have their supply lines have been cut off. They have been taken away. But if you want to talk about how they maintain any semblance of financing, well, all evidence indicates that they do that through control of aid coming into the Gaza Strip. This is a key part of their military strategy, and this is where you see the footage of trucks coated in armed men sitting atop these trucks, UN trucks that have been taken over once they've entered the Strip, for Hamas to take away and siphon off food, supplies, elements that are meant to be widely distributed. And this has been part of the problem, and something that Israel and the US and others have railed against. The reason the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation exists is because the UN supply lines that existed had been being controlled by Hamas, and they were using that to sell, often at exorbitant rates, food and supplies back to their own people in order to continue financing themselves. Now, this is a sick abuse of an aid system that's meant to help these 2 million people in order to get the supplies, food, and aid that is critical to their ongoing existence to them. But until those supply lines are cut, again, until Hamas is removed from power and is unable to control these mechanisms of power and be the most organized group within the Gaza Strip and not be replaced by something, whether it be from outside stakeholders or other more moderate groups within inside the Palestinian community, this is not going to change. And this is the biggest problem that we're seeing here.
So when the IDF goes in, are they going to do more on the humanitarian aid? Do you think that will allow them to control these trucks and make sure that the people are fed so starvation is no longer an issue in Gaza?
Look, I'll say, Dan, this isn't the goal. The goal is not for Israel to be managing the direct deployment. Israel has done so only as a relatively last resort in the face of, as I said, these controlled mechanisms from the UN and others that were not reaching where they were supposed to and being co-opted by Hamas. Israel does not want to be running aid organizations inside Israel. As I've spoken to multiple soldiers on the ground and other commanders, the IDF here in Israel, Israeli soldiers, IDF soldiers they're trained for fighting. They're not trained for the distribution of humanitarian aid, and that shouldn't be the long-term goal. The long-term goal would be for some other stakeholders who can act as more neutral parties, of which there are many potential. This is not some pie in the sky. There are potential other stakeholders that can come in. As in most other ongoing conflagrations around the world, there are third parties that come in, help mediate, help mitigate, help provide aid, and help distribute. But they need to do so in a way that doesn't allow Hamas to continue to perpetuate its power mechanisms through the control of aid. And that is precisely the problem. Israel doesn't want to go in. The idea of this military campaign, as far as it's been explained to the public, is that its goal is to go in and root out the last bit of Hamas, but not to become an ongoing, long-term occupation organization. It's meant to be a short campaign. Now, whether that's truly what happens, many a short campaign in history have ended up considerably longer than they were intended to be. Obviously, you mentioned the U.S. Forays in Iraq and Afghanistan, as they were both meant to be very short, quick expeditions to root out certain goals and then leave, and turned into multi-decade wars. But the hope here is that if we can root out Hamas, or if Hamas, better yet, is willing to put themselves, to put their arms down and say, all right, we're done. Let's think of actual solutions. We'll turn the hostages and we'll actually get some sort of solution here. That would be something that benefits everyone. And by everyone, I truly mean Israeli military and civilians, but also, most importantly, the Palestinian civilians who are currently suffering under this almost 2-year-long bombardment and ongoing war.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, the U.S. was in Afghanistan for 20 years. Let's hope that this doesn't last 20 years there in the Middle East. But listen, Asher, I have so many more questions, but sadly we're out of time. But thanks for joining us today. Good luck, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.
My pleasure, Dane, as ever. Thank you so much.
Great. Let's take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll be back with our next guest.